Thank you, Richard. Thank you all for coming out tonight with fear of rain and everything else. I appreciate you all being here. On behalf of Napa Valley Arts and Lectures, I certainly thank you for coming. I also want to take a moment to thank our primary sponsor for tonight, Steve Gregory, Morgan Lane Realty. Also, thanks to Bookends for coming here tonight and providing the books, which you can get. Some of you may have gotten before and will be available after, and Cathryn will be there to sign them. Appreciate that. And, of course, to Richard and to everyone else here in Copia, thanks so much for allowing us to participate with Copia in Napa Valley Arts and Lectures. Tonight, it's interesting. Tonight is Brain Night in Napa. I don't know if some of you know, there's an event that the County Office of Education is putting on over at the District Auditorium about the adolescent brain, which I thought was kind of an oxymoron when I first heard about it. But in any case, I know the focus of that is that, you know, the young person's brain isn't really developed until they turn 25. We're going to be talking tonight about what happens from about 40 on. And I was thinking about that today and realized that except for those years between 25 and 40, that's the sweet spot. It's either bad before or bad after. But most of us in this room know that once we turn 40 or a little bit older, the thought of forgetfulness sometimes becomes very unnerving, very frustrating. And for some people, it's really terrifying. Our guest this evening, Cathryn Jakobson Ramin, in her book Carved in Stone, talks about these feelings.
Carved in sand.
Carved in sand, I'm sorry. I forgot. The good news is that Cathryn approaches these subjects with some compassion and some humor and sets out to try and explain to all of us what midlife forgetfulness is really all about from various perspectives, from a psychological perspective, from a physiological perspective, and also from a sociological perspective. The book itself really began when Cathryn wrote an article entitled In Search of Lost Time for the New York Times Magazine back in December of '04, and it had become the second most emailed piece in that Sunday's paper. Apparently, it truly struck a nerve, and in fact, that article went on to become an award-winning article as one of the most notable essays and articles written in 2005. She's been a working journalist since she graduated from Tufts University, where she also studied drama and psychology. She published her first article in American Girl magazine when she was in 3rd grade. She wrote for a while for Barron's as a financial writer and worked as a freelance journalist for dozens of publications before she headed off to Los Angeles to continue her career as a journalist. She came north to Northern California, where she continued working as a journalist and as an accomplished author. And in addition to her writing, she teaches a weekly class called Garage Art to middle school students. We'll hear more about that later, perhaps. She's also a member of the National Association of Science Writers. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce Cathryn Jakobson Ramin to talk about her book, Carved in Sand, When Attention Fails and Memory Fades in Midlife. Cathryn?
Thank you very much. It's Bill, Mike,
Bill.
George?
George.
Okay. I don't know, is the mic working fine? Can everyone hear? Yes? Well, I was quite perturbed to hear my first joke go right out the window because I almost always begin by saying, congratulations, you don't have that extra set of tickets pinned to your bulletin board, the ones that you missed using. That happens to people very, very often. I have a box, it's marked tickets. At the end of each year, there are usually at least 1 to 2 sets of tickets for events we have missed completely, never crossed our mind at all. But I'm very glad to be here. I'm very impressed with the facility. The facility is just beautiful. I spoke last night at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, which is a revered institution, certainly, but the lighting is from 1972, and I was in the dark, and so is everybody else. Well, as you know, I wrote this book, Carved in Sand. It's not written in ink or, inscribed in pen or anything else. It is, in fact, carved in sand. And when I came up with this title, I thought about it this way. I thought that you know, most of what goes into our brains does not necessarily stay there. Thus, it's carved in sand. It's as impermanent as if you see a dune at the beach and the winds and the oceans change that, and it's simply not reliable. Well, I was talking to a radio host in New Zealand, of all places, which requires a very early waking. And he said to me, "I love your title. It is so meaningful." And I said, "Really? What do you think it means?" And he said, "Well, carved in sand, because the point of your book is that even though there are certain predestined things that go on with us biologically, physiologically, that none of it is in fact set. We can change our cognitive futures." And I said, "I love you, love you, love you. You are just a brilliant man, and I'm adding it to my repertoire." And that is so, it is so correct. Because although there are certain things about you, who your parents were, what kind of an early life experience you had, what kind of health you're in, how physically fit you are, these things have set you on a course in terms of your cognitive future. But I like to say it's all written in pencil. None of it is set, and you can change. And all of you right now are in a position where there is still plenty of time to rearrange how your brain is going to serve you for the rest of your lives. Now, I'm here because in my early 40s, I discovered that something was happening to my mind. I didn't know what it was. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know whether I should call it memory loss. I didn't know what to call it. All I knew is that I had been an investigative journalist for many years, and I had stopped working for a few to raise my 2 little boys. Had a great time doing that, and as they went off to school, I was interested in getting back to my work. Now, granted, investigative journalism is not an extremely simple thing. You tend to have stacks of documents like this high or so all over your desk. And one of the things you have to do is really get through them fairly quickly. You're looking for certain types of information. You need to be able to skim. You need to be able to absorb. You need to be able to retrieve what you've absorbed. And overnight, apparently, that ability left me. And I thought, well, damn, I am going to need a new career. This is not good at all. Other things that I had taken for granted also became very elusive. I had been able to sit down in an interview and do, you know, journalists always have steno pads. That's what we use. And I'd sit there and I'd put a little chicken scratch here, a little chicken scratch there. Then I'd go home and type up my notes as if the guy or woman was sitting next to me talking to me. Guess what? I go home, I look at the notes, they meant absolutely nothing to me. I didn't know what it meant. I apparently was no longer encoding that information as it was coming at me. And I didn't want to tell anyone, because it's not the kind of thing you can share. I could just envision myself calling an editor and saying, you know, hey, I'd like to really pitch this story, but actually I have a lot of word loss, so I'm not really sure if I'm going to be able to come up with any of the phrases that, you know, you usually pay me for. I didn't even want to mention it, to be perfectly honest, to my husband, because you could get teased for a thing like that. Once your family works out that you are not the steel trap they assume you are, they could take advantage of you. And, but they found out, because, you know, there were enough pediatrician appointments that we went to where I said to the receptionist, my goodness, you must have written it in for the wrong day. And after a while, I determined that no way were other people making that many mistakes, that it definitely had to be me. I was missing a mental calendar, apparently. I had always kept a calendar. I wasn't one of these whizzes who doesn't need a calendar. Don't you hate them? But I had always kept one, but I could leave it on my desk and go out and do my day and not completely miss things. Well, unfortunately, that was no longer the case. If I couldn't see it, if it wasn't squarely in front of my nose, it did not exist. And I did not know what was going on. Now, a few years went by like that. They weren't great. And then I started to notice that among my friends and colleagues, similar things were happening. I'd sit in a cafe, and I am the world's greatest eavesdropper. You never want to sit near me. I'll know your business. I may comment on it, actually. But I'll sit there and listen to the conversation going on behind me, and it would go something like this. There'd be two women in yoga clothes sitting there, and they'd say, one woman would say, you know, I saw the best movie the other night. Oh, my God. What was it called? You know, it had the actor, the same actor that was in, Cold Mountain. I think that's what it was. So you know that guy, the one with the blonde hair who was in it. And then somebody would say, oh, yeah, I read a book. Oh, what was the title? The conversation would move on to restaurants, people they knew, people who were married or divorced to or from people they knew. No matter what, information was missing. And I came to call this the contentless conversation. It was tremendously common. It was more common than not, as a matter of fact. You go to a social event, or I have to go to an awful lot of school events, and those make me extremely nervous because these are people I have seen regularly since for many, many years, since my children were in kindergarten. And there is an expectation that you will know who they are by the 7th or 8th time you meet them. Well, I thought I was bad until one of my friends, the father of a friend of my son, said, his name is Vince, and he said to me, a terrible thing. He pulled me aside. He knew what I was working on by then. He pulled me aside. He said, a terrible thing just happened. I said, what is it, Vince? It's going to be okay. I'm thinking, something has happened to his daughter, perhaps. He said, well, I just spent 10 minutes talking to that woman over there, and then I introduced myself and asked her name, and it turns out we talked for an hour and a half last year at the same event and went out for a drink. So his dating life was on the line, his academic life was being challenged, and he was very, very worried about it. And you'll find Vincent carved in sand. You'll find 300 midlife adults in carved in sand, because I didn't want this to be just my story. It is, to a large extent, my story in that I go through 10 interventions, checking every aspect of memory, whether we're talking about sleep, whether we're talking about hormones, whether we're talking about stress or depression or mental exercise or physical exercise or diet or you name it. I went through an intervention. I even went through a mindfulness meditation class and slept a great deal in there, which was not the general idea. That wasn't why I drove to Oakland once a week on Thursday at 6 p.m. from Mill Valley. So there we have 300 midlife people. How did they come to me? Well, when I started asking questions, they started talking. And often they would be talking to me while I was waiting for a bus or in the school parking lot, and I'm thinking, what is wrong with this picture? They are giving me all this fabulous material. They're handing this over to a person who can't remember anything. How good can this be? And I'd be pulling grocery receipts out of my bag and scribbling stuff down. And I thought, well, could I just carry a digital tape recorder with me everywhere and say, so, how's it going? Click. Well, that could be a little bit intimidating, to tell you the truth. So I thought, I have to have a system. I'm very big on systems because my life will not run unless everything is organized and systematized. And I devised a survey. Now, a survey, traditionally, when a psychologist or a properly trained individual does it, is a sort of a yes and no, and you can check it all off and be done with it in 5 minutes. Well, that was not the case with my survey. My survey went on for 16 pages, and it had about, by the end, it grew, but it had about 18 fairly open-ended questions. If you're interested in it, you can see it on my website, which is carvedinSand.com. And I thought, okay, I'm going to send these out by email to everyone I know, and they will go in the email trash. And then I'm going to send hard copies to people who feel a little intimidated about doing this in email, and they will go in the regular trash, and it'll all be over really, really soon. And that isn't what happened. What happened was that people, it went viral. It went madly viral. People started to send this survey off to their college roommates, to their sister-in-laws. Whole companies started to fill it out. I was in Nordstrom one day, and their salesperson, a woman, was having a very difficult day. I mean, things were not going well, and she had just brought a purple blouse to someone who wanted a gray one, and gray pants to someone who wanted purple pants, and she was about ready to tear her hair out, and she'd also miscalculated my bill, and we were now on the third go-round. And I said, you know, I don't want to be insulting. I'm not even suggesting anything really here, but I'm in the middle of writing a book about memory and attention and what happens in midlife. She said, just a minute. And I thought she was going to get the manager and throw me out. And she goes away. She comes back 3 minutes later. She has a string of saleswomen with her. There's a string. They're coming from every department, from Donna Karen to Liz Claiborne. They're all with her. And I said, what? What? And she said, they all have the same problem. They all want to take your survey. And so the surveys came tearing in, and I had to, of course, obviously I had to read all of them. As I got through them, I started to think to myself, well, I really want to know more from a lot of these people, but it won't do for me to fly around the country interviewing them one at a time. So how will I handle that? And I set up discussion groups in about 7 or 8 cities, not always cities, suburbs around the country, and 12, 14 people, men and women, would come. And I would always supply, which is more difficult than you would think in a strange town, a very nice cheese platter with good fruit and et cetera. And the host of the event would supply the wine, lots of wine. And these people would not leave until they had scraped the brie completely clean. There was no more wine. There was nothing to eat. It was practically time for breakfast. Then they were ready to go. So I had wonderful contributions to the book in that way. But it wasn't going to just be what scientists refer to as anecdotal material. Although, I mean, writers love anecdotal material, scientists really don't go for it. It has to be substantiated. You need lots of studies. You really want to have a book with plenty of science, but science in a really accessible way. And the only way I knew to make science accessible was for me to go and sit with some of the foremost neuroscientists, cognitive neuroscientists, endocrinologists, sleep specialists, psychiatrists all over the country, and to hear what they had to say, to read their studies, and to start to make this field coalesce. There is no field called midlife memory. That just doesn't exist. You're talking about a multidisciplinary field that's just starting to come together. But it was so wonderful to go see these scientists. Now keep in mind, I've been a journalist since I was 17 years old. Mostly people slam the phone down in your face. That's what they do. You know, I am rarely, in my career as a business writer, I was rarely good news. If I was on the phone, something bad had happened, and you know, it was not something they really wanted to talk about. But here I was in a completely different sphere, and it was wonderful in that scientists, no one ever wants to listen to them. They are left, they work and they write and they have to deal with so many failures. I mean, a scientist's life is basically about things going wrong all the time. Once in a while, they go right, then they write a paper, and then everything goes wrong for 10 more years. So I got a great earful. I got the inside story. I got to spend time in the labs, and I was very patient, and they could take me around and say, look at this, we have a really big magnet, and I would admire the MRI machine for a while. I was at UCLA, where they have a very sophisticated memory center, and I was fortunate enough to work with Dr. Gary Small, who I always referred to as the memory maven until other people started referring to me as the memory maven. I didn't tell them to, but so now we're both the memory maven, he and I. But he put me through all the paces. He did a limited neuropsych battery. I had a PET scan. I had an MRI. I did an entire nutritional program with him. And he really put me on the road to getting this book done. And I'm not sure what this gentleman, it's Bill, it's George.
Sam.
It's Sam.
Right.
Sam. I'm not sure what Sam is going to ask me, and I live, as a journalist, I live in mortal fear of treading on some other journalist's questions, you know, because they like didn't have breakfast because they were so busy writing questions, and I don't want to step on it, but I want to talk to you at least for a moment about what it is you are going through here. Most of you will probably say that you have issues with memory. That is most likely true for only a very limited number of people here. In midlife, the issue is not memory. A frank memory problem would be this. Someone hands you a multiple choice test of vocabulary, words you have known all your days, and you no longer can select the definition. That would be a memory problem. That would be serious. What is going on for most of us are changes in attention. Attention, concentration, focus, call it what you will. It's a frontal lobe function, and as we get older, things change in our frontal lobes. They actually begin to change fairly early on. You were just talking about the adolescent brain, and you know, that's just fine. They sort of straighten out, what, about 22 or 23, that adolescent brain? Well, at about 30, things start going downhill again. In your late 20s, if you're any kind of primate, if you're a human, if you're a chimpanzee, there are changes that occur in processing speed. You simply are not moving information as fast. And you feel it, not usually in your early 30s, that's quite rare. Some people start feeling it in their mid to late 30s. Virtually everyone knows about it by their mid 40s, and by 50, it's a given. You certainly do find that you cannot produce names as fast, you lose track of words, you have certain problems with mental mapping, spatial issues, so that even if you've been to a place several times, as I have been to Copia, which did not stop me from making 2 wrong turns while getting here, that these things, they come harder. And why is that? It is basically because of neurophysiological changes, as I said, in the frontal lobes. Simply put, the synapses are not able to transfer information as quickly. They're not because the myelin layer, which I was trying to describe on the radio this morning, try to describe something where no one can see you, or using your hands. As I got into it, I thought, oh, this is really stupid. You can't explain this without using your hands. The myelin layer, envision tiny cocktail wieners. Have we got that? Okay. And a long string. It's the tail of the axon. Now, slide the wieners onto the string, yes? That acts as insulation. That's called the myelin layer. As you age, the myelin layer begins to degrade, different speeds for different people. It is not replaced at a sufficiently quick rate. And the electrical potential that must leap from neuron to move information is slowed. That, by and large, is what you are feeling. Now, some of you are feeling something else. Some of you are saying to yourselves, yes, I'm wildly distracted. I know that. I go from the family room to the kitchen, and I have no idea why I'm standing there. Well, you're suffering from interference. One of the scientists, who I just love, said to me, this is how it is. She said, you know, when you're young, it's as if you have a neural bouncer standing at the gates of your brain. It's like the bouncer in a nightclub standing there with his hand or her hand, there's some big gals out, with their hand on the velvet rope, preventing the riffraff from entering. And as you get older, that bouncer starts to go on a lot of coffee breaks. Now there's no one manning the door, and anything gets in. So I say there are a couple of types of interference. One is external. Your son says, Mom, I have to leave for school in 2.5 seconds, and I cannot find my math binder, and I will fail. Well, that'll knock you off your path pretty quickly. The other one is internal, which is you're walking from the family room to the kitchen when you suddenly realize that the checks you thought you mailed are in fact on top of the refrigerator in the garage. That will throw you off, and in fact, when you hit the refrigerator, you won't know why you're there. Some of us experience changes that are not frontal lobe based. It's really fascinating research. It's quite new. people who have had very difficult childhoods show changes in the hippocampus. The hippocampus, they're shaped like this. They're as much in the center of the brain as they could possibly be. And the hippocampus, in people who have had very troubled childhoods, perhaps where there was not sufficient attachment with, most psychiatrists actually say the mother, but I think that that's a little sexist maybe, but this is what they say, sufficient attachment, experience changes in the frontal lobe, in the hippocampus, and the hippocampus begins to shrink. When you have a hippocampus that has started to lose volume, you begin to have difficulty with the kinds of things that tell you where you are in space and time. Has anyone had really a lot of trouble remembering when something happened? If it was last year or 5 Thanksgivings ago or 2 Christmases back? Well, people who are suffering from these changes in the hippocampus don't know where they stand in place or time or in relationship to other people. And it can be very, very disconcerting. I cover that in a chapter here because usually when I take questions, there's always somebody who says to me, you know, I understand about working memory. You're talking about working memory. And by the way, I'm really never talking about short-term memory because that is not a scientific concept. There is no such thing as short-term memory. Working memory is what you need to hold in order to continue with your train of thought, your conversation. And there's these little tiny blips of memory, such as that's a pretty print dress. I don't need to know that, so that will go right out. But I do need to know that right now I'm talking about working memory, and soon I'm going to talk about long-term memory. That is the role of working memory. Long-term memory, someone will always raise a hand and say, you know what, I don't remember my childhood. I really can't remember much about when my kids were born. In fact, I don't really remember a lot about my wedding. What's going on here? These are the people who are often suffering from hippocampal changes. And I think that research is going to go gangbusters. It is very often associated with depression. Nobody has quite tracked down how these work together, but I do talk about it a lot in the book. Would you like to move into questions now? Or?
Let's do it.
Okay. Oh, wait, not yet. I forgot something.
Yes.
You know how when you can't think of a word, it's very frustrating, it's very upsetting? Well, when you can't think of the word or the phrase to describe not being able to think of a word, that is worse, yeah? So to prevent that from ever happening, I developed this mug. It can be found on my website. There is a very clean version and a slightly, mildly, unoffensively obscene version from which I will read tonight. I hope no one's offended. There are places in the Midwest where people are offended by this. Okay. So here are some terms to keep in mind for when you just can't think of what you need to say or do. There's brain fog, and we all know that, right? There's brain fart, as foggy as a summer's day in San Francisco. There's the senior moment, spaceball, spaced, space cadet, too many balls in the air, too much information, too much on my plate, losing it, drawing a blank, blanked out, middle-aged moment, brain freeze, not the sharpest tool in the shed, a few fries short of a Happy Meal, blonde moment, often attributed to me. There's CRS, as in, I'm sorry, I'm suffering from CRS, at which point everyone steps back. That means can't remember shit. There's craft you can also use, and that's can't remember a fucking thing. You can be peeling an empty banana, fuzzy as a mohair sweater, unfocused, out to lunch, fried, losing my marbles, scattered, ditzy, a space shot, out of it, a few cards short of a deck, mental pause is a good one, brain cramp, 1 brick short of a load, the lights are on, but nobody's home. And then my real favorite came in one of these sorts of events where a man raised his hand and he said, I have another one for you. I said, go ahead. He said, out where the buses don't run. I was like, but I made the cup and there's no other line. What am I going to do? So I will sit down with you, okay?
Okay. Thank you. One of the things that you talk about in the context of all of this is the idea that from an evolutionary perspective, we were never designed to do as much as we're doing, to process as much as we're processing at midlife and beyond.
Well, that is really accurate. You know, we were designed for obsolescence, just like your computer. You know, the idea from, I don't want to get into whose idea that actually was, but the big idea was that we would reproduce and then quietly disappear, because otherwise we use too many resources, you know, and there's simply no reason for us. And we have, of course, worked against that. Modern science has changed that. Modern science has changed everything. You can get new knees, a new heart, a new kidney, you know, you can get anything replaced practically. So far, not your brain, however, which is something to keep in mind. I am being slightly blinded. Do you think we can get one spot a little lower?
Richard,
maybe?
Somebody?
Well, if not. My glasses will get really dark, and I will start to look very hip sitting here. So yes, from an evolutionary standpoint, we are not supposed to be around, but we are. And we've also made some other choices, some of them more conscious than just living. We are doing everything awfully late here. So when I started writing the book, researching the book, I went around to every 80-year-old plus I could find. I mean, I'd walk up to people in the market, on the street, in the hairdresser, anywhere, and I'd say to them, I want to talk to you about your memory. My memory. But then I would say, I did a lot of this in New York, I would say, well, tell me, in midlife, when you were 50, did you notice anything? And inevitably, this person would say to me, no, I did not. I did not notice anything at 50. I did not notice anything until I was in my 60s. And I thought, you just forgot. I know you just forgot. But I kept on going, and I asked over and over, and I always got the same answer. And I started to think, now, why is this? This is the kind of question I love to ponder. I ponder it in the shower. I just ponder it everywhere. And I started to think about, well, what is different? Well, first of all, we have uncontrollable flow of information. Not everyone, I know there are people in this audience who have made a choice and who are not getting email day and night and maybe do not have cell phones. I don't like to generalize about this because there are plenty of people who make a choice not to do this. But the gross majority of us are wired and on day and night. And I most recently got a phone that gets email. It's a great convenience for me, but there is no time. If I had it now, I'd probably be looking, you know. And so we have this flow of information that never, ever stops. And that is something that our parents and our grandparents didn't experience. You pretty much had to answer the telephone or open the door to get news. It wasn't just going to show up of its own volition. That's changed. We also do everything later. I mean, many people have a very long adolescence. We should probably check with those brain people about that. It can go well into your 20s. People go to school much longer. They start their jobs later, and they change careers often, so they are perpetually on a sharp learning curve. They like being on a sharp learning curve. It's very stimulating, but they are always have tremendous demands, intellectual demands. And then they marry late and have children late, which brings to mind a collision that should probably never occur, which is adolescence and menopause. Big in my house. And so all of these things work against our memory and our attention and make it really, really very difficult. Now, what are we going to do? We're going to throw up our hands and sit back and get a rocking chair? That's not going to happen. I mean, if you look at the statistics, 80% of people over 65 intend to continue to do some kind of work. No one is retiring in the way that we used to know about retirement. It's simply not. It's not desirable anymore. I mean, these retirement communities where people sort of exclusively play golf and cards, they're going wanting because people don't want to necessarily do that now. So we have to do everything in our power to keep our brains in shape. And people say to me, give me the 4 things, radio hosts particularly, give me the 4 things. I'm like, it's 5:30 in the morning here, and you want me to give you the 4 things? Because many of these interviews occur on the East Coast in drive time. And I say, okay, here they are. Very simple, really. Take a look at your nutrition. Make sure that you have enough omega-3s in your diet and antioxidants. Everyone says, oh, omega-3s, you get those from eating fish. That's cool, I like fish. You would be so mercury poisoned if you ate enough fish to take care of your omega-3 needs. Something like, you look up the statistic in here, but like 40% of Americans have an omega-3 deficiency. There are whole parts of this country where they never eat fish. They wouldn't consider eating fish. But you can supplement that by using flax seeds and certain types of nuts, all described in great detail in this book. Antioxidants, well, eat your fruits and vegetables. It's a good idea. You would have to be a grazing animal in order to get enough antioxidants into your system. Really, you'd have to eat all day long. And so it may be necessary to supplement your antioxidants. Now, should you just give up the fruits and vegetables because you could just take the antioxidant supplements? You should not, because fruits and vegetables are digested in a very, very different way than the supplements that come in the capsule. Fruits and vegetables stay in the gut a long time. The antioxidants can be very well absorbed. If you simply take those capsules, they go through the system really quickly. They are supplements. They are not the real deal. So what else can you do? You want to continue to have a mental challenge in your life. Now, people in midlife say to me all the time, a mental challenge? Are you kidding? You know, I have a job, I come home, there's dinner, there's homework, there's laundry, there's cleaning. You know, the weekends are jam-packed. I got to drive to all these sporting events. You know, this is as much mental stimulation as a human being can possibly stand. But the fact of the matter is, it's very exhausting, I'll grant you, but it is not necessarily mentally stimulating. In fact, it can be boring as heck. And to have a mentally stimulating aspect of your life is of key importance. So people always say to me, do you mean I have to do calculus? I mean, I'm really not equipped. And I'm not equipped to handle my 8th graders' math homework, so calculus is really out of the question. I said, absolutely not. I recently have spent some time with a group of older, 50-plus tap dancers from Massachusetts. This one woman, she runs tap dancing classes, and for whatever reason, possibly because she's in her 70s, almost all her students are over 55, and the bulk of them are in their late 60s and 70s, and there's a couple 80-year-olds doing flaps and ball changes there. And they are very committed to my book. They are a sales force of about 80. You don't want to get near them because they will sell you one. And they were recently invited to perform at the AARP 50-plus conference in Boston, which was a 5-day event that brought in 100,000 people, if you can imagine. So they didn't perform in front of 100,000 people. I mean, even that made me nervous. But they were the opening and closing acts. And these are folks who, what do they have to do here? Well, is tap dancing just aerobic? It is aerobic for sure. But it's so much more because you have to learn combinations. You have to interact with a group of other people or there will be a terrible crash and hips will go out and it'll be a mess. And so there are these things, but it's also, and this is a key point, socially interactive. So many of us are spending so much time alone. And if we're not alone, we're with the same 1 or 2 people, and maybe there's not all that much to talk about. You know, it's just, you're just as used to this other person as if it was a part of yourself. To get out, to be socially involved, and to talk to people, very, very important, no matter what age you are, because this is what the brain grooves on. Without social interaction, the brain is not functioning at its peak. It was built for this. As human beings, we were built to talk to and be with other live humans. Now, when scientists do studies and they use MRIs and they use other types of scans, and they look at people who are looking at a photograph or people who are looking at people, the difference is immense in what parts of the brain are engaged. And so my advice is get out, get a bridge group, play Scrabble with someone, don't play it with your computer. Try to get away from your computer. I think there are great benefits to it, but most of us spending way too much time there. I mean, if you're shut-in, if you cannot leave the house, there's a really good reason to be sitting in front of that computer, but otherwise, not too good. I talked to this one woman in Los Angeles who was just a hot ticket. I mean, she was in her 70s. She had a tremendous amount of energy. She was so lively. And she said, you know what I like to do? She said, I like to get on a bus in Los Angeles. I said, you get on a bus in Los Angeles? You know, that in itself is astonishing. But she did, and she'd take the bus to a new neighborhood, someplace a little distant, and walk home. And she said she found so much to look at, so many things that were interesting that she would have never seen before. She was out in the world, and her mind was as lively as can be. So there's the aerobic exercise, there's the mental exercise. In terms of aerobic exercise, many of us think that it would be a good idea to take a nice, calm, restorative yoga class because we're basically nervous wrecks to begin with, and we just need to calm down. And it is good. It's really good. It's just not good for your brain. It doesn't do what you need to do. If you're in midlife and you're still in reasonably good physical shape, you need to have aerobic exercise several times a week. Why? Not because I want to torture you, but because we need to pump blood to the brain. That is how you save yourself. You make sure your brain is getting enough blood circulation. Now, I've had people advise me that this can be accomplished perfectly well by standing up and doing a forward bend. And I say, yeah, I know, but you might pass out if you do it for too long. So, you know, these are key ideas. Something to fend off, as if your mind depended on it, is obesity. This is a great big danger zone. Unfortunately, few people choose to be obese. I realize it's not something they select. It's typically something that selects them. But it is a very direct road to Alzheimer's disease. And more studies are showing this every single day. I don't think there's a slightest doubt about it. Very often obesity is accompanied by hypertension. Untreated hypertension is a big problem. Untreated diabetes, a big problem. And then something called insulin resistance. Who's even ever heard of it? Probably no one, unless you've read my book or you've read some, peer-reviewed studies in professional journals. Insulin resistance is a very, very early form of diabetes, and it is incredibly common among midlife adults. 40% of midlife adults in the U.S. are not using their insulin properly. How do you fix it? Is there anything that shows on the outside? No. Is there anything that shows in your typical checkup blood panel? No. And only recently are physicians starting to realize that they need to do specific glucose tolerance tests in midlife to assess whether there is insulin resistance. It is remarkably easy to fix. That's the great part. If you drop 10% of your body weight and you exercise regularly, boom, it's gone. You are back where you need to be. You don't do that, you gain more weight, a little more weight each year, as often is the case in midlife, you will be on a nice direct route to diabetes. That's a terribly grim way to end this, and I'm not going to. So let me just say that people say to me, well, what do you have to do first? I just don't know what to do first. I said, it's very simple. You don't need to leave your chair. You simply have to acknowledge that there is a problem. And this is much harder than most people think because there are a lot of implications that come along with saying, you know what, my attention is not what it used to be. I'm going to have to make some changes. There are implications in terms of aging. There are implications in terms of potential pathology and who you will be as an older person. But it is critically important because you will save yourself so much grief, and you will save yourself what can be a very debilitating situation in terms of self-esteem. We all know how that is, right? You find that you've lost a phrase, you've lost a name. It's sort of embarrassing. It happens once or twice, no big deal. When it starts to happen really a lot, it can affect self-esteem. Certainly affected my self-esteem. I really wondered how I could be a person who could be out in the world if my stock in trade, if my inventory, words, were not available to me readily. So it can be fixed. You get your mental challenge. I wrote this. Try a little neuroscience for 4 years. That'll do it. And you can find yourself in a much better place.
There is the self-perpetuating aspect of it, as you talk about. You were talking about chronic stress, the impact that has through the release of cortisol and the like on the hippocampus, but the stress of being concerned about losing one's memory, not being able to remember those names,
Right.
not being able to remember those events. In many cases, that stress can exacerbate the problem.
Well, it can make you rather anxious. You know, you're at a social event and you see someone coming towards you who you can more or less identify as your boss's wife, you think. You're not quite sure. But that person is, let's see, Mary Ann, Mary Lou, Mary Beth, Mary Elizabeth, Mary Jane. It's Mary something, and she is upon you, you know? And the more anxious you are, the less access you have to working memory and to retrieval. It becomes much harder to retrieve information. So I think that's what you're referring to.
You talked a little bit about the supplements before, but there's also the prescription drug side, a route
Yes,
that
there
you
is.
also experimented with.
Yes, I've experimented with drugs. Actually, I cannot get a life insurance policy now. What do you think of that? because of what I went through in this book. And I've sat there with a life insurance adjuster and said to him, I wrote a book. It was for the book. It really was, read the book. It's all in the book. And he'd say, I don't know, I don't think we can insure you. You know, you've experimented with drugs that are used for narcolepsy. And I said, well, I don't have narcolepsy. No, I don't. But the fact is that you have to be very, very, can I stand up?
Please.
Thank you. I'm getting stuck. You have to be very, very careful about what your doctor writes a prescription for. MDs are how many MDs in the audience? Hands up. Because I usually feel there could be a death threat when I say this. Oh, just one. Okay. How big are you? I can take you on, right? MDs are notorious for addressing the problem at hand. And you can't really blame them. It's their job. You come in and you say, you know, doctor, I've been feeling a little depressed. I'm a little anxious. Don't worry. We can take care of that. Try some Prozac, and to get you over the hump, have a little Ativan too. You'll feel better. You know, you've been through a rough time, and come back to see me in maybe, 3-4 weeks, and we'll talk it over. Usually, that second visit never occurs. Very often, frighteningly often, that prescription is refilled over and over and over again. I wrote a piece for O Magazine called Valley of the Dulls. That was about 2 years ago, and it's on my website if anyone wants to take a look at that. What it was about was antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, and how often people who really need them, start taking them, and then they keep taking them for 12 years. And in the course of this, Oprah's community is enormous, and I was receiving emails from all over the place, from people who'd been taking them for 12 years and 15 years and 20 years, and who had been very, very, very good students and had tried to go back to school to change their lives and make something of themselves, and found they couldn't remember anything at all, and they had to drop out again. Very few, if any, associated antidepressants, and even more so anti-anxiety drugs, with changes in memory, with the inability to hang on to working memory and It is. It's extreme. It's very extreme. Had some dental surgery a couple of weeks ago, and it was going to go on for 3 hours. My periodontist said, you know, I don't think I can keep you in a chair for 3 hours, and we'd like to give you just a little anesthesia. You'll be awake, you know, but you'll know what's going on, but you just won't want to punch me and jump out of the chair. And I said, that's probably a really good idea. Let's do that. Well, people are still telling me about conversations that we had in that 2 or 3 days. I don't remember. A gentleman I know had some back surgery, ordered a whole lot of stuff from Best Buy right afterwards. He didn't remember that either. So drugs that you don't think are going to hurt you, they're not going to hurt you. It's going to hurt a whole lot more to have, periodonture without them. But there can be side effects. There very often are. Very common drug. Dramamine, scopolamine, the patch people put on if they're going to go on a ship and they don't want to, or a sailboat, they don't want to feel nauseous. Those drugs wipe out memory completely. When scientists do research and they want to wipe out memory in lab rats or mice, scopolamine, that's what they use. Takes it right out. So if you find that you're out on a cruise ship and you don't remember a thing, check to see whether you've been hitting the Dramamine pretty hard. Other drugs, lots of other drugs. People who here has gotten up at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, my God, I have to get back to sleep. I'm going to take some Tylenol PM or Excedrin PM or any of the other PMs. No one's going to raise a hand. 50% of you have done it. I know that. And I'm going to ask you about heroin right after this.
And everybody will raise their
hand. And the hands go up for that. So, well, it's not a great idea because although you may get back to sleep, you will be drugged until noon the next day. And I have had people tell me that they take Excedrin PM every night. Sometime in the course of the night, they figure it's harmless, they wake up, they take it, they go back to sleep. They are blitzed through lunch, and they have no idea why. So there's an entire chapter in my book about drugs you might be taking, whether, across the board, many, many different kinds of drugs. Another thing to consider is that oftentimes physicians jump to conclusions. It's part of their job. They're trained to look for the most likely thing. That's what they're supposed to do. They're not going to go, you have a cut on your foot. Let's see, what could it be? Maybe it's diabetes. They are trained to say, you have a cut on your foot. Let's see, is it infected? We're going to treat the infection and come back in 2 weeks and let's see if it's fine. That's how they roll, as my 16-year-old would say to me. So the fact is that very often you go in and you say, doctor, I think I got some problems with my memory. It doesn't seem to be working too well. And you get a doctor of a certain age, that would be our age, who says, you know what, I have the same problem. Not helpful. And also there's a huge issue out there right now with MDs who can't remember anything, and it's getting to be pretty serious. So what do you do when your doctor gets your blood panel back and says, oh, your thyroid is perfectly fine, everything looks good, maybe you're a little depressed, that can have an impact on memory. Here, take the antidepressants and it makes you worse. How do you avoid that? Well, you really have to be very analytical about what's going on with you. And if you believe that maybe you are depressed, that could be it. If the depression resolves and the memory, and you get off the antidepressants and the memory problems stick around, it probably wasn't depression. You may have memory problems that are completely separate. Be really wary if your doctor tells you it's depression, unless you are somehow ready to accept that information as accurate. Unfortunately, sadly, in the course of writing the book, I interviewed quite a lot of people, about 8, who were in the early or mid stages of Alzheimer's disease in their 50s. Okay? Not in their 70s, in their 50s. And it was a very, in some ways, the saddest thing I've ever done, certainly one of the most moving things I've ever done. But what I discovered is that all of them had suffered from depression long term in their lives. They had been treated for depression, and they had resolved depression, but the depression actually covered up other changes that were occurring in their brains that should have been addressed much earlier. So what if you feel like you need an evaluation? What do? You can't, your MD at best will give you something called the MMSE, and that is a test that goes something like this. What floor of the building are we on? Something I never know. So that's, you know, what county are we in? What state? What's today's date? Something I never know. No writers ever know what the date is. Other questions, you know, spell world backwards. I'm going to give you 3 words. I'm going to ask you to repeat them. Well, if you're pretty high functioning, typically you can handle most of this. And it doesn't mean that you're not experiencing some memory changes. You could be, I mean, Albert Einstein could handle that, you know? I mean, it's simply a matter of where did you start and where are you now? And an MD doesn't typically have a baseline neuropsych evaluation to tell you where you started. So my recommendation to people, first of all, on my website, so many people asked for this, I had to do it. I put a list of every university center for the study of memory in this country and some out of the country are on the website. And at every one of those, these are major centers. They know what they're doing. They're really, really smart at it. And they will do evaluations if you need them. Having a baseline neuropsych evaluation is a really good idea. Now, do you have to spend $4,500 for this? No, you do not. You can have a very simple neuropsych evaluation, and these can even be done online these days. And you'll have a baseline. You'll know where you started, and if 3 years from now you've dropped several points, you'll know that's not a good sign because that should not actually be happening. So I'm going to stop now and take questions. Don't you think that's right?
Sounds like a fine.
Okay.
Start right here.
Okay, now wait. You need to really speak them loudly or the people behind you won't hear, okay?
I have several questions, but I'll start with the first one. You talked about drugs that can negatively impact memory. What about drugs or nutritional supplements that actually enhance memory and mental function?
Well, they certainly are out there. And in my book, I really detail the program that I got on. Now, one thing I'm very careful about is I am not a scientist. I am certainly not a doctor. I'm a journalist. And therefore, I can never recommend any kinds of supplements to anybody specifically. I can only tell you what I did after a great deal of study on the subject. But in the book, I talk about what supplements can be very, very helpful. And of course, I have to write everything down because otherwise these numbers would come out so very, very wrong. But in addition, okay, most of you probably take, you know, a regular multivitamin, yes? Yeah? Okay, well that gives you a minimum daily requirement. It is enough to stop you from getting rickets, and that's a very good thing. But it is not necessarily enough to keep your brain in shape. So you want to make sure you've got a top quality multivitamin, and it should have, and I assume you're all going to buy the book, but this is also on the website if you need it. 400 micrograms of folate. Folate is a B vitamin. It is very, very critically important to cognitive health for reasons I go into in more detail than you want to know here. But you need to see that. That should appear in your multivitamin. That's how you know if it's a chintzy one or not. Huh? And then you want to also make sure you're getting those omega-3s as described. You want to make sure you get plenty of magnesium. There are studies being done now at MIT that suggest that most, can you imagine this, most of what we experience in midlife in terms of changes in attention and focus may be due to magnesium deficiency. There is no magnesium in our food. It has been leached out of the soil. You're not going to get anything significant that way. You have to, if you're going to buy this information, you got to take magnesium. Coenzyme Q10, who's heard of that? Yeah, okay, very good idea. Alpha lipoic acid, who's heard of that? Now everyone always asks me about ginkgo. Everyone knows about ginkgo, yeah? Well, in midlife, ginkgo is not too useful, I'm sorry to inform you, because ginkgo basically is helpful if the blood circulation to your brain is sort of inadequate. And so it is often given, in Europe, it is, in Germany, the #1 prescription drug. It is a prescription drug given for early symptoms of dementia. But as long as you have sufficient blood supply, blood circulation to the brain, you're getting your aerobic exercise, et cetera, right now, ginkgo is not a must-have. The others come way before. Does that answer that question? There were several parts to your question. I think that was the first part.
Back there.
Okay.
Yes, I appreciate you've given us some reasons and rationale to accept what's going on without too much concern. One of my problems is the overlap of symptoms with things that are much more serious. And your mind takes you in that direction when some of these incidents happen.
Mm-hmm. So you mean that there's some incidents of forgetfulness that are just profoundly disturbing?
Well, just to start in the beginning with incidents of forgetfulness. Mm-hmm. Is this the start of something more serious?
Well,
or are we just
it certainly can be. You know, I would love to be able to say to people, hey, you know, you can tell the difference. There is a huge difference between people who are moving into Alzheimer's disease and people who are experiencing normal changes. But unfortunately, there is not a huge difference. I say that it's like a tree, and everyone is moving up the same trunk, and most people will go on to be part of the main part of the tree, but some people are on that road to dementia. It's unquestionably true. We all are experiencing changes in the way our brain is dealing with proteins. They're supposed to be in a soluble state. They're supposed to be loose and floaty and free, and for some people, those proteins start to aggregate and clump and strangle neurons. There are lots of reasons why. I go into them in the book. Some people are going down that road, and if you notice that you are becoming really forgetful, and if your family members know this, or your colleagues at work are noticing, I had talked to several judges whose bailiffs noticed long before they did. They knew before the judge did that the judge was developing dementia. Then it is really time to get an evaluation, and I encourage you to do so, because there are forms of early intervention, early diagnosis, early intervention, and that is when you can slow the process of this disease if you get there early. Now, I realize how difficult it is to get there early, because I've seen this in my own family, and we have been through it, and I know the stigma. And I know how everyone wants to make everything seem like it's really okay. People are still functioning. Spouses often cover for other spouses. There is no benefit to this. This does not help. All it does is assure that when that person moves into second stage Alzheimer's disease, the descent will be very, very fast. And it's not something that you want to see. I have to say that I try to encourage people to think about participating in clinical trials. There are so many drugs being tested. There's so many procedures being tested. We're seeing really good results with a lot of those. But if people don't volunteer, then this research can't move forward at the rate that it really, really needs to, because we are looking at such huge numbers of people with dementia in the next 25 years that it will swamp our economy. We really must find an answer. And that answer is going to apply to people in the earliest stages of the disease. Once neurons are dead, you cannot resurrect them. We do not know how to do that. It will probably never be the case. When they are slowing down, when they're not firing that well, when the proteins are starting to aggregate, that is a time that this can be addressed. There are now multiple ways of treating this. All of them remain, there are some drugs that don't work too well that are on the market, but most of these remain experimental. That doesn't mean that if you have a family member who is going down that road that they should not participate in clinical trials, and you can go to clinicaltrials.gov. Every clinical trial in the country, and actually most in the world is there. You can search it every which way. And if you need help, you email me, because I've helped a lot of people find clinical trials.
What about the research into diagnosis and earlier biomarkers for this?
You are getting very technical. You think this crowd, I thought they liked the jokes.
That too.
How do you make a joke about that? Well, that's no joke. So very seriously, there is an enormous, hugely well-funded study afoot right now looking at what are called biomarkers. These occur in the urine, in the cerebrospinal fluid, in the blood. And the hope is that several will be found that will show very early that the proteins are beginning to aggregate, as they do in Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia as well, just in slightly different ways. And there are people here at UCSF who are leading this initiative. I mean, it's a tremendous initiative, and they're at the forefront of it. I think they have all their participants now for the study. They were gathering them for the last 2 years. I believe that study is full, and they are starting to see some results now. And this means that, you know how you go in, you get a cholesterol test, or prostate test, or whichever test you get. Within a few years, you're going to go in and you're going to also have a test to see what's happening with your amyloid proteins. And when physicians see those numbers out of range, they're going to decide how to handle this. And there will be medications, vaccines, et cetera. That's what's coming.
Over here.
Yeah.
Day-to-day practical tips for supporting that absent-minded or working memory functions beyond the biological?
Strategies. You need strategies. I don't know if you do, but someone may need strategies in your family or among your friends. You have a friend who needs strategies. But the fact is that, as I said before, acknowledging the problem is of key importance. And for me, I had to get very, very micro on this. I had to say to myself, truly, how much do you enjoy looking for the car every time you go back into the parking lot? Is this something that you really like doing? Because it's avoidable, it's just going to take a little work. And I decided that the panic I experienced every time I walked out of Macy's was really not worth it to me, and that it was better to get out of the car, take a moment to look around and say, well, today, Wednesday, I am parked in front of the Sharper Image about 6 rows down. And when I come out, that's where my car is going to be. Because it was simply too easy for me. I'm always thinking about something else. I've got a million ideas going at all times to jump out of the car carrying the pants that are too big for my son, run into Macy's and come out and go, oh my God, it's Christmas and there's 5,000 cars here. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Strategies that first you have to determine where the shortcoming is. And then you have to specifically select a strategy that will help you solve it. Do you want to give an example of a shortcoming? What kind of stuff do you forget?
Heading upstairs for one thing and doing 2 or 3 things on the way. Even at work, it's usually the string of things.
Right.
A couple things get
Right.
added. Guaranteed it's the first 2 things you start about to do that are not
Right. That's how my husband goes to the supermarket and comes back with all kinds of cool stuff, but none of it is what I asked him to get. I'm pretty sure that's the reason. Well, here's an interesting thing. There's a study that I talk about in the book, and it's about what happens with midlife adults and later is that rehearsal goes away. Apparently, in younger adults, there's this little birdie in here that just constantly says over and over, on the way home, get milk. On the way home, get milk. On the way home, get milk. You don't have to think about it. It thinks about it for you. And as you get into midlife, the rehearsal stops. Now, it was fascinating with this study because the scientists set it up so they instructed the midlife people to rehearse. They told them to rehearse. They still didn't rehearse. They just didn't have enough working memory to handle the task at hand and rehearse. It was neurologically impossible. So in fact, you're subject to a lot of interference. You know that you cannot multitask in that way anymore if you ever actually could do it. You can't go upstairs with 3 or 4 things on your mind, and you will need to rehearse. You know, you're going to have to say to yourself as you're going up, I'm going for my wallet, that's what I'm going for. I'm not going to stop on the way. I mean, my wife on the way, I'm going to say, hello, dear, going for my wallet. That's what it is. So, you know, and then you have to do this all the time. I am one for throwing things in the doorway of the bedroom because that is the only way for sure those things will go with me in the morning. I have whole conversations in the shower about how critically important it is that I remember X. And as I say in the book, my favorite is, you must take printer paper to the office. You must take printer paper to the office. I get to the office, I'm typing away, I know I'm on deadline, I hit that print button, I hear, and that's the printer telling me it's completely empty and I don't have the paper. So I had to come up with a strategy. And one of the scientists who was in this book helped me with that. He said, try to go more than this sort of abstract notion of paper. Imagine how would you be carrying that paper and what would it feel like as you approach your car? With the paper, you have that sort of sticky, shiny paper or plastic on the outside. Maybe you put it in, where do you carry it? Do you just take it loose? Do you put it in your brown tote bag? If you do, how does that feel? Is it kind of heavy? Is it's not so light, you know? When you're opening your car door, imagine what it would be like to have to open the car door with one arm around your briefcase and the other one holding your paper. And when you get to the car, it's a miracle because you say to yourself, here I am at the car, something isn't right, what's missing? And I've been using that strategy ever since he told it to me for all kinds of stuff. And I find it works extremely well. You've got to do more than just think about it. You need to visualize it, feel it, smell it, just use as many of your senses as you possibly can to identify what this thing is and make sure you end up with it.
Over there.
Dementia and Alzheimer's are 2 different things, I think.
Well, there are numerous forms of dementia.
If we live long enough, don't we all have dementia?
No.
I'm from long-lived people, and 94, no dementia.
Right.
And no Alzheimer's. But
Right.
the point is, when should we, what ages, I know Alzheimer's can hit at 40.
Well, that is a very specific type of, well,
When does it hit?
well, is your question, well, you say you asked me,
I'm not giving ages or parameters.
I'm-
I just wondered, but
well, you know, there's really no way to give them because, as I say, I interviewed all of these people who developed Alzheimer's disease in midlife, you know, in their 50s, right? It happens. It definitely happens. And what we're seeing now is more and more, you know, it's fascinating. Statistics, I love statistics. They fascinate me because you can bend them any way you want, basically. And all of a sudden, New York Times, massive increase in the number of people being diagnosed, the number of people who have Alzheimer's in their 50s. Big article. And I'm thinking, there's no increase in the number of people who have it. There's an increase in the number of people who are being diagnosed with it. It's exactly the same number of people, I assure you. It didn't change from year to year. You know, your question, I think, at the bottom of the question is, when should you worry?
no, but what's dementia to Alzheimer's?
All right, let's try to define terms here. There are many types of dementia. There are about 6 different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. I've had many people say to me, oh, yes, my grandmother was senile, but she didn't have Alzheimer's disease. Most scientists now think there is no such thing as senility. It is a form of dementia, and most likely, if it involves memory, Alzheimer's disease. So it's possible there's vascular dementia. People have strokes and they develop cognitive problems. That is not necessarily Alzheimer's disease, but sometimes is also accompanied by Alzheimer's symptoms. So now you understand the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? Okay, Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. Okay?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, you do that.
That's all right.
I
Go
know,
ahead.
I rarely have this. It's wonderful.
Could you speak a little bit more about the relationship of the ability to listen and working memory?
Very, very important. I don't know if everyone heard the question. The ability to listen and working memory as you age. One of the things that happens is that as we get older, there are changes in hearing. And these are very, very common. Almost everybody suffers some hearing loss in their 50s, and it becomes much more obvious as the decades go on. And many people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease who, in fact, have hearing loss. They're not hearing it well. They're hearing it enough to, they're kind of pretending most of the time that they hear it. They're catching bits of it. They don't get it right, so they're told, could you set the table and use the good china? And 2 minutes later, the table is set with the kitchen stuff, and someone says, my God, he's losing his mind. Well, what he has lost, possibly, is his ability to hear that part about the good china. And these situations occur all the time, and so it's remarkable, and very rarely is hearing checked in evaluations for Alzheimer's disease. And it should be one of the first things that's checked. I mean, if you can't hear it, you can't encode it, you're certainly not going to retrieve it if you didn't encode it. So, there are lots of really phenomenal hearing devices these days, and they're invisible by and large, and it can make a huge difference for people.
Up there.
Quick question about, it's almost like the absent-minded professor, that there's nothing that's really been wrong, but somebody who's totally focused on a task will lose sight of all the things around them. And I'm specifically talking about my 18-year-old son.
The most forgetful people on earth. Yeah.
But he actually takes after me, and I think what happens is that as you get older, if you have that tendency, you seem to notice your memory loss more. But I'm not.
Well, very often the opposite is true. People who are inherently space cadets usually don't end up in careers where they have to be extremely precise and on time and have the facts and be able to stand and deliver. So my experience has been that the people who have really great memories often end up in careers where it's very important that you have a great memory. This is a skill. That's how you ended up there, right? Those who are much more free-floating in their approach frequently end up in areas where this is not so important. I mean, they're frequently artists where that's sort of irrelevant unless you're maybe trying to sell a painting or show up at a show. I mean, it's not the key thing, right? It really isn't the key thing. And so oftentimes I hear from people, I have always had a terrible memory. Always, my whole life. That would not be me. I'm talking about other people. I've always had a terrible memory. I've always had to have strategies. I've always had to keep a calendar. I've always had to check and double check. And so I don't really notice much, to tell you the truth. It's about the same as it always has been. And I hear that a lot. It's from the people who ended up in very, very cognitively demanding professions who seem to suffer, both women and men. And I do want to make that point, because many women have said to me, I know what this is about. I said, well, okay, what do you know? It's about menopause. And I have to tell you, it's not about menopause. There is so little research that would even suggest that the perimenopausal years have any influence on memory. It is the only time that this is the case is when there is the cessation of estrogen at menopause. Your body gets a little freaked out for a short period of time there. But basically, it's not about menopause, and women and men experience this. Although they experience it in different ways, they experience it just about equally as far as I have been able to discern.
Over there.
Can you say a word about software that's being produced
Yes.
intensively to help?
I talk about it in the book a lot, actually. I was a very early beta user of Posit Science's program, which a lot of you probably know about. It's had a lot of press, and it's got some major, very serious venture capital behind it, which is a little unusual, but there it is. And I had a lot of thoughts about it, actually. I have a real problem with directing people to improve their brains by sitting in front of a computer screen in midlife. Now, this doesn't mean that Posit Science isn't working great for people who have no longer got the ability to get out and get around. And it's showing some excellent results in assisted living facilities. Mike Merzenich is a brilliant man. He is at UCSF. He also runs this, I don't know, he's chief scientific officer, I believe, of Posit Science. And he's doing remarkable things in assisted living facilities with this program. People are improving their, they're dropping 10 years off their cognitive age. I mean, some really great stuff. Do I really think that that is the best approach right in midlife? You're all out here, you get out, you get around, you see people. I really don't. I really think it's a mistake. To become that involved with a computer program. To use Posit Science, and I don't have, the facts are in the book, I can't quite nail them right now. You need 45 minutes 5 times a week, I believe. That is incredibly timed, a great big huge chunk of your life that just went out the window. And you know what it's going to be. It's going to be your tiny disposable time that is going out the window, right? You're not doing this instead of going to work. You're doing this instead of reading a book or cooking a meal or doing any other number of cognitively challenging things. One thing I discovered is that there's a program, very cheap. Now, Posit Science is quite expensive. It's around, I think, around $450. There's a very cheap program on the internet. It's called My Brain Trainer. And it costs, I think, $9.99 for a 3-month, $9.99 for a 3-month subscription. It's kind of cool because it was developed by a man who developed it not for people in midlife, but for graduate students, postdocs, people trying to get into medical school, people who wanted to take young brains and make them better. And he's a statistician and very competitive fellow. So it's really devised around competing. Not only do you compete with yourself, which is mildly interesting, but you compete with people in your field, people of your age. I swear you can compete with people of your hair color if you want to, but he's got this set up so you can be constantly in competition, and it's set up so that it's like circuit training. You know when you go to the gym and you do all the machines, right? That's circuit training for your body. This is set up as circuit training for your mind. Each exercise is a minute long. You could be through the whole darn thing in 10, 12 minutes. And I know people who use this as part of the coffee break at work. Instead of sitting around stuffing a cruller into their mouths, they actually do this instead, and they say they feel very, very lively. I also know a man who got so addicted to it that when his firstborn child came along rather late in life, I might add, he attempted to hold her and do it with his toes. It wasn't so successful. Do we have time for another?
Time for another 1 or 2 questions. Lee?
Many, maybe most of us who have some loss of memory become concerned because of the association we have with dementia, one kind of. Of course, Alzheimer's is what we read about mostly. But would you say, is it fair to say that most of those people with memory loss never end up with any form of clinical, recognizable, or significant dementia?
It would not be fair to say that. I'm sorry to tell you. It really would not. I don't beat around bushes, typically. And it would not be fair to say that, because by the time people are 85, 25% of them have Alzheimer's disease. I mean, that is a very high statistic. That's a very high number. And so we cannot say that the bulk of people who are having memory issues don't develop this disease. If they live long enough, a quarter of them are going to. It's right now, until we see the biomarker tests come through, very difficult to say early in life, in midlife, who is taking that road. But some percentage of people are taking it. And the very best things you can do, I have just described. in terms of exercise, mental stimulation, diet, keeping your weight down, keeping your blood sugar, your hypertension. Try to stay off of cardiac pumps. That's not a good one. And these things can change how it's all going to work out. Now, we know this because there are studies now of twins, identical twins, same genetic material, of course, and what we're looking at is one twin who develops the disease and the other twin doesn't. There is always a lifestyle difference, a profound lifestyle difference, because the groundwork is there. It's been laid. You know, they are walking around there. Too complicated, it's all in this book, but there's something called the ApoE4 allele, and this is a genetic variant that definitely, although it doesn't mean that you will develop Alzheimer's disease, is not what they call a deterministic variant. It is one that predisposes you towards the disease. So we get situations where you have identical twins, both carrying that variant. One gets it, one doesn't. You can make a difference. You really can.
One more question in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you start? You can spend a lot of money just sort of spinning around with different doctors that may or may not take you seriously.
Well, you should, I mean, I hate to be self-promoting, but absolutely this is where you start, because it will help you hone in on what the problem is. It's very, very possible, for instance, it's a subject we didn't address tonight at all, but that you may be suffering from sleep deprivation. People in midlife, especially those of us raising families and working, very often are. And there's an entire chapter in here about sleep deprivation, which can be volitional. You can just decide to burn the midnight oil, or it can be, you can be an insomniac. It can be uncontrollable by you. But very, very often, people think that they are developing signs of dementia when in fact what they have is a real serious issue with sleep deprivation. That's just one example. Other examples are thyroid disorders are very common in women in midlife. One of the first symptoms of a thyroid disorder are cognitive problems, fogginess. People describe it as fogginess. And in fact, I found that I was suffering from a thyroid disorder. I didn't know it. I had had regular blood panels done that didn't show it, but it turned out to be the case. And as soon as it was treated, within about 2 months, I was able to play Race the Thesaurus and beat that sucker. You know, I do this, thesaurus is of course online in my case, and I would type in the word I was trying to come up with the right word for, and I'd see if I could beat the thesaurus. And I had never been able to beat the thesaurus, but once the thyroid disorder had resolved to a certain extent, and this takes time, it doesn't happen overnight, I could beat the thesaurus. And as you can see, there's no real shortage of words here.
Cathryn Jakobson Ramin, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
You are so welcome.
Thank you.
Well, you didn't have to ask too many questions.
You made it easy.